Howdy guys, Rex here. I'm going to do a comprehensive review on the Steiner M7Xi 4-28x56 rifle scope. I got this deal from opticsplanet.com. Now I've had this for a couple years now, and I like to get a lot of experience before I share my opinion with you. When it comes to scopes in this price range, it's such an investment. I don't want to steer you guys wrong, so I like to use it in a diversity of different conditions. I've actually taken this all over the country, and so there's a lot of different environments and a fair amount of time that I like to spend with an optic before I can decide one way or the other, like what the fine points are. Because when you're talking about optics in this price range, sometimes the quality, you start paying a lot of money, and you really have to look at the finer points to determine where that quality you purchased is actually sitting. And so without further ado, I'm going to go over the overall configuration of the rifle scope first. I'm going to talk a bit about the reticle. It's got the MSR2 reticle and the one I'm using here. And then I'm going to talk about my opinions on how everything worked out. So first off, this is a 4-28 power in a 34mm main tube, the 7x zoom. A 7x zoom gives you a real good amount of flexibility at a lot of different distances if your reticle is set up properly. And I think this one is actually not bad. It's got a little more weight towards one end of the spectrum than the other. We'll get into that in a little bit, but it does have good flexibility at a lot of different distances. You have a really good field of view, so you can do a lot of observing and fire control and stuff like that. And you can also do some of the rapid target engagement on the lower powers, but when you crank it up to its medium powers, you have your classic long-range rifle scope. And if you want to use it for identifying targets or doing really fine milling work where you're using a stadiometric range finding to determine the distance to the targets in an environment where you don't want to use lasers or something like that, then you can crank it up to 28 power. And this thing has enough optical quality to where you actually can use that 28 power without really losing quality. The M7Xi has been designed to be marketed to your tier 1 fighting units. This has been used by special forces all around the world. Multiple countries use this. A lot of snipers and a lot of different militaries and police forces are using this optic. These have been used in a variety of very tough conditions, from northern Europe up where it's very cold, in the deserts, lots of different corrosive environments, all different kinds of stuff. These do have the Steiner Heritage Warranty, which is nice to have because with an investment this big, you want to be able to get help if for some reason you accidentally break something. And it's not only waterproof, it is actually constructed with a very rugged one-piece design for the 34mm tube, which really works well when they try to give its waterproof rating. When they change the atmosphere on this optic and they're testing it, that does help. This one does have a variety of reticle options available. The one I used was the MSR2. For the style of shooting I do, I thought that would suit my overall needs the best. And of course, most people have heard of Steiner. I remember when they started redoing these tactical rifle scopes a few years ago, I tried one of their prototypes when they first came out, fell in love with it. I've been following their military series for a while. The M5s are phenomenal. They're great. The M7 was designed to improve upon some of the things in the M5, and so we'll take a look at the features. The magnification is 4-28 power. The tube diameter is 34mm, which is very common in scopes in this tier. Of course, it's a first focal plane reticle. The exit pupil diameter is from 3.3 to 10.4 millimeters, depending on your magnification. It does take batteries. For illumination, it's the CR2032s, which is very universal. The illumination is an LED type illumination, and it is in the red color, and it's just the very center aiming cross is illuminated. It does have 11 brightness settings. The click values on these scopes are 0.1 millirads. It's got 94% light transmission. For a scope in this magnification range, that's actually pretty darn good. Its operating temperatures are rated from -40 degrees Fahrenheit to 160 degrees Fahrenheit. Both of those conditions I will actually find out here where I'm at in Dakota. It does get down to 40 below Fahrenheit, and it can get up to 160 Fahrenheit if you're storing it in a vehicle and it gets that thermal heating going on. It is designed to be very shock resistant. The finish on the one I got is kind of, I think it's what they call their coyote brown color. It's got some green to it, and we'll talk about that after a little bit, but it's definitely not black. It's kind of a cool color if you're into style, but I'm all about functionality. I just don't like it to be solid black. Getting it all dressed up for the dance, it's a lot easier to work with something that's not black. The new Steiner has an updated set of turrets that offers 15 mils of travel per revolution with a small revolution indicator that pops up out of the turret on the second turn. 26 millirads from the zero stop to the top of your elevation range after you get everything set up. The windage turret offers you 6 mils of travel in either direction with a total of 12 mils of travel. It is designed with a short overall length that creates a bit more rail space. I think they were trying to make room for thermal imaging and night vision devices, stuff like that. It does have lower profile turrets than some of the other scopes in this class. I do like that style, not only because the footprint is smaller and it doesn't snag up on as much stuff, but you can see over the top of it better. It'll increase your situational awareness, if you will, and it will give you more options for different add-ons and accessories if you choose to do that. This thing is actually waterproof up to 20 meters. It's about 65, 66 feet, and it can withstand up to 900 Gs. Of course, being a Steiner, it has the internal parts from Wetzlar, Germany. The Wetzlar 5-piece adjustment mechanism is going to give you very precise windage and elevation adjustments. You're going to have very repeatable accuracy. You're going to have tracking graduation precision. If you dial in 13.1 mils, it's going to dial 13.1 mils. We did check that on the True Stick, of course. The reticle does match the turrets, and the turrets were designed to give you audible feedback click by click. These M7Xis are available with the MSR, the MSR2, which is what I have here, the G2B, which I actually really like because it's very clean and simple, and it does have the Tremor 3 reticle. If you've been watching those movies with those graboids that come out of the ground, very, very useful for that. Also, very widely used in Special Forces circles. It's something that a lot of guys really respect, and it works very well once you figure out how to use it. Okay, let's talk about the low power settings. So as we have explained at our various training events and seminars, we like to explain a Riflescope as being the toolbox for the reticle being the actual tool you're going to use as your aiming point. The MSR2 is a nice balance of a reticle, in my opinion, for the kind of shooting I'm doing. I like to have a reticle that I can use for a lot of different things that gives me as much capability as possible as you can fit inside the glass. And I think if you study the MSR2, you're going to find there's a lot of different capabilities you have that you're not going to see with some other reticles. First off, we'll start at low power magnification. So if you crank the scope down to 4 power, this is a 4-28 scope, you go down to your lowest setting, you're going to notice right off that you have the entire upper half of the view is kept very clean. That's for scanning and searching. You don't want that too obstructed. Also, if you're trying to spot the bullet trace, if you're spotting for someone, or if you're spotting your own trace, it's nice to have that upper half relatively clean so you can spot the subtleties of the atmospheric disturbances. You can see mirage. There's a lot of different things that you need to see when you're shooting in long-range precision applications. Now, if you look at the reticle hairlines, you have some thick bars on the outside, and then you have some very thin ones. These are actually scaled for different magnification settings. The heavy hairline bars are scaled for both area spotting and rapid aiming reference use. If you look closely, you can see on the sidebars they have stepped numbers in full 10 mil increments. This reminds me a lot of the M22 binoculars that you're going to use to kind of get someone onto target. If you're using a target reference point system, everyone knows where a certain TRP might be. You can point at that, and then on lower magnification, you can actually go off to the side 40 mils. And it'll actually increase your communication when you're doing area observing or spotting or forward observation. You'll also notice that the very, very heavy lines on the sidebars are going to help you at closer ranges where it's a very thin reticle on the vertical subtensions, and the very center of it is going to be pretty small. A little bit harder to see quickly at 4 power. You can still see it at 4 power, but if you're trying to make a quick shot, those heavy sidebars will help get you zeroed in a lot more quickly. Another thing that's really handy if you have the reticle designed correctly for use at its lower magnifications is actually you can make it very, very ELR capable, extreme long range. Now at the RX 3000 classes we've done, we had targets set up from 1,000 to over 3,000 meters. And these are relatively small targets. Most of them are about 30-inch squares, which is plenty small enough when you get that far out there. And for ELR shooting, you're not going to have enough elevation adjustment in your turret typically to get out to those long distances. It's very common to have to dial back on the magnification when you're shooting 3,000, 4,000 yards. A lot of times your magnification might be dialed back to 5 power. The low magnification with a very large field of view is going to offer you that possibility for extreme long range holdovers. And if you look from the center of the reticle, if you have it dialed back on 4 power, you're going to see all the way to the bottom beyond 40 mils. On a 50 BMG, for example, you're going to need about 40 MRADs to get out beyond 2,000 meters. That's if you're zeroed in on your center aiming point being around 100 meters. And the cool thing about variable power is you can use your higher magnification, like 28 power, to identify and mill your target to determine the range. Then you can dial back to 4 power, and you have access to all your ranging out to beyond 40 mils. 40 milliradians is a fair amount of holdover. However, we have shot farther than that, in which case the reticle was thinking ahead. It does have spotting hash marks above the center line, above the center aiming point. If you look closely, they have them marked at 10, 20, and 30, and that's very good for ultra long range shooting applications, what we like to call ULR. If you need like mega holdover, even to extend your range on your 50 BMG, for example, from 2,500 meters, which was about a 60 mil holdover, to 3,000 meters, you're going to need another 30 mils at least. For example, if you take advantage of the 40 mil ranging mark above the center of the crosshair all the way at the top and add that all the way to the bottom with the 40 mils of drop available, you're going to have a total of 80 milrads of drop for ultra long range shooting applications. And if you dial in the available elevation on your turret as well, now you have over 100 mils of total elevation, which is going to get you out there pretty far. Now, if you need more than that, you might have to get yourself a TACCOM HQ Charlie Tarak unit. But for most applications, this is going to be very, very useful. So for an extreme long-range scope, if you're using a big Magnum, something like a 338 Lapua, and you're going to really try to push it out there, or a 375 Chi-Tac, 408 Chi-Tac, the 416s, and what I like to use, the 50s, which is my favorite for extreme long range, because you can actually see where it's hitting. It's going to be a great reticle for the 50. Like if you got a Barrett, or if you got whatever 50 you're using, and you're going to do extreme long range shooting, you can actually get the dope to go out that far. Now, if you crank up the scope to medium power, like what I would call 10 to 15 power, you're going to notice that you have a lot of other features in the reticle. You have very clear and easy to read 1 mil marks, and they have half mil tiny little marks in between them, which are actually finer than the 1 mil marks, so that when you crank up higher, you can see those a little more clearly, but they're not going to be confused with the 1 mil marks. And you do have a little bit longer of a hash for the 5 mil subtensions. So even though the reticle might appear a little bit complicated at first, the core of the reticle, the actual horizontal and vertical subtensions, are pretty straightforward. The core is pretty simple, which I like. So it's a very clean, simple reticle. You do have some additional markings on the inside. There's a lot of different things. You can see right here, if you look closely, you do have markings that are at 0.1 mils, so you don't have to use your spatial perception to kind of interpret how that is. If you're doing real precise mil ranging, which you would do in a lot of real world circumstances. So if you're doing milliradian based stadiometric ranging, which I can think of quite a few applications where that would be necessary to use. There are times when you might lose your laser rangefinder, it might run out of batteries, the atmosphere might not work, the collimation of the beam might not be appropriate for what you're trying to shoot through. There's so many different things where you can't use a laser. Also, there are certain environments tactically where that could be hazardous to projecting electromagnetic radiation onto the battlefield. This scope gives you the tools necessary to use passive stadiometric rangefinding using the reticle in a simple math formula to determine the distance to your target relatively effectively out to maybe a little over 1,000 meters. You have the capacity to give you a quantifiable actual measurement down to 1/10 of a mil. Now, if you look to the bottom and left of the center aiming point, you're going to see that they have stadiometric, the L scale. Now, this is great for medium range when you can actually see it a little closer, and you can actually see this all the way on maximum power as well. There are situations where if you're actively transmitting a laser, that's going to be bad, and therefore your passive ranging methods might be the only safe way to determine your target distance. So you have an L ranging bracket here. It's an inverted L with 10th mil increments. You can go out to 5 mils. You can stand your target on the bottom of the 5 if it's over 2 mils tall, and you can get a very precise reading on how far that is using your standard mil ranging formulas. Basically, you take the size of the target in inches times 25.4 divided by however many mils tall it is. That'll give you the range in meters. Or you can take the size of the target in inches times 27.77 divided by the mils, and that'll give you the range in yards. Standard stuff we teach at the classes. Always good to know how to do that. You might not probably ever use it, but if you do need to know how to do it, it's good to know how to do it very well. Also, the scope does feature, if you look on the bottom right of the center aiming point, stadiometric 400 meter to 1300 meter instant fail-safe ranging. So basically, That's a pretty handy feature. You're going to see a similar setup in a lot of different optics out there. A lot of the East Block stuff has features like this. You simply place a target horizontally from shoulder to shoulder into the bracket, and it'll tell you the corresponding number. If it fits inside the 4 bracket, a target's going to be about 400 meters away. If it fits inside the 12 bracket, it'll be 1,200 meters away. If it's inside the 8 bracket, 800 meters away. This is based on approximate standard size for a bad guy. So if you need to do quick ranging at medium distances, this is going to be a relatively effective method to go with if you have good clear view of the target at these different positions. You can also stand the target up on the line there to get a full height, just like you would in other rifle scopes that have a similar feature. Now, at higher magnifications, you have a whole nother set of features that reveal themselves in the reticle. Like if you go above 15 power, like 15 to 28 power, and you pay close attention to the very center portion of the reticle, you have a very compact 1 mil by 1 mil center illuminated area. Now that's the only part of the reticle that's illuminated. It's designed that way to minimize your interference with twilight performance. The cool thing about any of these reticles is if you're smart and you know what you're doing, you can actually use these for simple memorized ranging skills. Now if you look at this center aiming point closely, and then you're going to have from the center of that aiming point to the edge of the red, you're going to have half a mil. So all the way across is going to be a full mil in either direction, from the top to the bottom or from the far left and right side. That's going to be a full mil, and then obviously a half mil to the center at any spot. Now if you use the face width of the target, the actual width of the face from the side of the head to the side of the head looking at you, and it brackets the full mil, that entire crosshair is in there, that's going to give you an indication that it's approximately 150 meters away. Depending on how you have your rifle zeroed, that's a relatively easy firing solution. If you use the vertical portion of that same crosshair and you get from the chin to the top of the head, it might indicate a target distance of 250 meters. Now, if that target happens to be wearing a helmet or a hat, then you might have to add another 50 meters onto it. If the width of the face only takes up half of that, like one arm of that crosshair, now you can determine that your target is approximately 300 meters away. There's a lot of situations, hostage mitigation, stuff like that, where you might need to kind of get a quick idea and make a very precise shot. This will help you out a little bit. Likewise, if the target's even farther away, you can actually bracket the target. If you go from the chin to the groin with the full height of that center crosshairs, you're going to see that from the groin to the chin is going to be about 800 meters. If you go from the groin to about eye level, it's going to be 900 meters. And if you go from the groin to the top of the head, it might be closer to 1,000. Now, of course, if the target is running around in hammer pants or something like that, you might have to multiply it by the hammer pants constant to make an adjustment there. Likewise, if you go from the belt to the chin, that'll indicate about 600 meters. From the belt to eye level, 700 meters. There's a lot of ranging tricks you can learn here. You can do the shoulder width from the far left to the far right edge of it. If you can fit the shoulders in there, it's going to show you it's about 500 meters. That's an old standard. Any mil-dot scope will do the same thing. So if you know your target dimensions, you can use this as a quick ranging tool. And you can come up with your own custom ways of using this. Also, if you look at the very center of that reticle, you're going to see that the center dot is actually going to be 0.04 mrads, and the hairline thicknesses are going to be very thin as well. Now, if you crank the scope all the way up to its max power, that might seem a little bit heavy, but that's kind of done as a trade-off so that you can still use that reticle in those medium magnifications as well. So it's meant to be balanced out throughout the entire thing. That's one of the challenges with the 7x zoom is how thick do you want that reticle to be? I think that the MSR2 did a great job really balancing that out, thickening up certain lines when you really back off with the wide field of view so it's still visible on your very low powers, and keeping it thick enough to see it in your medium and high powers, but not too thick to where it's unusable at your highest powers. Likewise, if you pay close attention, you're going to see little tiny fine plus marks around the center cross that offer different positions. These are located 1 mil higher or lower than the horizontal subtensions, or 1 mil to the right or left of the vertical subtensions. These little plus signs here on the sides, those are not only used just for alignment reference points. So like if you have a close miss, you have some kind of reference point to know where that 1 mil space would be, kind of in a grid pattern. It can also be used as an ultra fine aiming reference. If you just dial in an extra 10 clicks, which would be 1 full mil up, and then another 10 clicks to the left, you can use that little corresponding plus sign as a very tiny, very fine aiming point. And given the tracking, graduation, precision that these scopes offer, that it'll actually be right on for you. But another cool thing about these little plus signs is the way they're designed is you could use it for improvised shooting positions. Like if you're in a goofy situation where you might have to be on your side, like where the rifle's laying at 90 degrees for whatever reason, there's a lot of different times when that might happen. Your zero is going to shift because the bore is not below the optic anymore. The optic is off to the side. And with 100 meter zero, for example, you're going to be off. It's not going to be a huge amount that it's off, but it will be noticeably off. For example, if you're shooting at 100 meters and your rifle is canted 90 degrees to the right, you can use the upper right plus aiming point and keep your turrets at zero, and it should be pretty darn close to that. Now, this is something you're going to take out and actually log, but those are reference points that you can also use for your canted shooting. And then, of course, you can add on using the corresponding subtensions in the reticle in whatever direction as holdover aiming with the canted rifle. All these things, of course, you want to have practice so you know how to do it. So overall, I really like the MSR2 in this scope. It's a very highly flexible design that I can use for very, very small targets, like if I'm going to do varmint shooting, or if I'm going to shoot water bottles to be a cool guy, or whatever I'm doing there, it'll work fine. It'll still work okay for quick target acquisition if I'm hunting movers like coyotes or whatever else might be moving on the earth that you want to shoot. You can crank it down to a lower power and have a wider field of view, and it's still functional there, especially if you light up that center aiming point using the thicker stadia off to the side. And if I want to do ridiculous ultra long range stuff, I have a lot of flexibility to really, really extend my ranges and give me a real hold off point if I need to do extreme long range fire. There are applications for extreme long range fire that are in the real world, especially when you talk about your very heavy calibers, your 50s and stuff like that. Very, very handy to have that capability. So here's my overall opinions of the scope after using it for the last couple years. I think the balance of feature sets is exactly kind of how I like to have it. I like the lower profile turrets. I think that the magnification range is nice. 4 power is low enough to where it becomes very flexible. You can use it for a lot of your normal applications if you have 4 power. I think it's optimized for its medium range. In a scope like this, I typically run them from 0 to 1,000 yards for most of my applications. If you do need to really crank it up for high precision shots or other applications, you have that. You can crank it up and the glass is good enough to where you can see what you're doing. The weight, of course, and the footprint of this, even though it's designed to be shorter, it's still kind of heavy, and it's a 34 millimeter scope. The footprint is semi-manageable for a scope in this class. It's going to be more compact than other scopes in this class that you might gravitate towards. The overall quality of the mechanisms, looking at them, and I've had a variety of different Steiners. I've seen almost everything that's out there, the M series, the T series, through all the different training classes we've done. I've seen hundreds of these scopes of all different flavors. The turrets on the M7 are different than the original military prototypes. The 3 to 15s, the 3 to 12s. Because there's more clicks per revolution, the actual 10th Milliradian clicks are closer together. They're not as crisp and they're not as robust as in some of the earlier models, but they are still tactile and audible. You don't need it to be a huge snap of the fingers for it to be effectively audible or tactile, but it does work. They're fine adjustments though, so it's something you're going to have to kind of get used to if you're used to a different kind of setup. Of course, the quality and the turret's actual function in terms of graduation reliability, if you dial it around, bring it back to 0, it's going back to 0 every time. If you dial it up or dial it off to the side, it doesn't matter if you get elevation and windage on it at the very extremities of the adjustment range, it's going to be very, very precise out to those extremities. You might see a tiny bit, like maybe a click or two at the far upper and lower extremities, but for most shooters, it's going to be totally undiscernible. And using it in applications where you're dialed up that far, you're going to have other problems, horizontally speaking, that are going to overshadow the noise statistically of that tiny amount of statistically discernible error you might have at the very far extremities of that adjustment range. The ocular ring has a lot of adjustment to it. It's smooth. You can tell it's put together tightly, and it looks like it's relatively robust. One thing you can do is after this thing is adjusted so that it doesn't get misaligned, you can either make an index mark on there to tell where it was at so that it doesn't get thrown off, or if it does, you know where to put it, or you can just tape it or put the scope cap on there and then it won't move on you. The magnification ring moves relatively freely. It's nicely greased. It's very smooth. It does get a little tight in extreme cold weather. This is something you might want to have set up ahead of time for whatever you're anticipating on doing there. A lot of these scopes that are very nicely put together do get really stiff. The grease actually gets cold in them, and they're pretty hard to turn. I have broken Schmidt & Benders before by cranking on the magnification rings when they were frozen, and so that's something to be careful with. Likewise, the parallax ring is nice and smooth. It is a bit tight. Again, in ultra cold weather, that's something you want to have set ahead of time. And the illumination ring actually has a different feel to it. This one, it doesn't have that same snug feel that the other adjustments do. This one is actually relatively loose turning, and not loose in a bad way, but it's not as snug. It does have off positions in between most of your settings, so you don't have to crank it all the way to one side to turn it off. Now, trying to give my most honest assessment of the glass quality, which is what a lot of people are looking for when they start spending this kind of coin on a rifle scope. Whether you're using it at high, medium, or low magnifications, the glass is very, very nice. Of course, this is apochromatically corrected glass. That means you're grabbing all three different wavelengths on the left, the right, and the center of your visible light spectrum. And you have three different densities of glass sandwiched together to bend that light into the same focal point so that you have a very sharp image. And that's what APO glass does. These German optics offer some of the best glass in the world in that category. Of course, each one is balanced with its different coatings and how it's engineered to give you different performance in different lighting conditions. Some scopes like Night Force will look very different than a Schmidt & Bender in the same lighting conditions, but they're optimized to be most effective with a certain anticipated lighting in mind. That being said, the scope performs great in the daytime. Absolutely no problem being clear. You can't really tell the difference between this and a Schmidt & Bender or a Hensoldt or some of your Kallas or Swarovski type scopes. This is right up there with all of those. In the daylight, you can't really discern. Of course, it's a little bit different of a color to it or something. It's not really that big of a deal, but that's kind of a preference-based thing. In twilight and darkness, this is where you see this kind of scope start to outperform a lot of other stuff that's not priced this high. So if you look at other really, really nice scopes, for example, in the $1,000 to $2,000 price range, even some of them, they get up in the $2,500 and $3,000 price range. When you get into twilight and you're trying to see detail in objects, or you're trying to see depth into different brush or grass, that's where this is going to start to pay off. You're going to see a noticeable difference in twilight, and in darkness, it's very effective. I've used this pointed at the sun at twilight, at sunset, where it's very difficult to see, where you would normally have a lot of washout. If you keep your glass clean, it actually is pretty darn good. I mean, you can see very, very well. Of course, for professionals, a lot of fighting happens during that time, so it is probably worth the extra investment to get something that's going to perform very well. That'll give you that edge for sure. Look at the quality of the reticle. The etching of the reticle is very, very well done, very sharp, and with the MSR2 design, there's a lot of fine stuff. There's a lot going on in there, not as much as some, but the etching quality is good on your very fine lines. It's very, very precise. The design of the reticle, like I said before, I like how it's balanced out. I think it has great application for ELR, ULR, most of your medium range stuff. It's optimized on that side of the spectrum. If you do come in closer, it's not totally useless. You still have those thick stadia off to the side, and if you use your illumination, it's a lot easier to maybe track a moving target at closer range with your wide field of view. The overall balance of the reticle, I really like for my applications of fire. There's different folks that might prefer different strokes, but for me, I really like the MSR2. I don't generally like stuff that's confusing to a guy, but the MSR2 is a good balance. It's very simple at its core, but it does give you a lot of added capability if you know how to use that. That's just more tools in your toolbox. The overall feel of the scope in terms of refinement is very, very nice overall. Almost everything on the scope feels really, really nicely made. The turrets on the Schmidt & Bender PM2s actually seem like more of a Swiss watch kind of feel to it. This is a little more mushy on some of those adjustments, but for all functionality, this scope performs almost as good or just as good as a Schmidt & Bender PM2 within your normal adjustment range. The ruggedness, as far as I could tell, I used it on the M82 for a while, the Barrett, which has a huge amount of bolt slam. It didn't throw it off. I've used it on different rifles. I did not go E1 on this thing to see if I could break it. It's too nice to do that. But I did get a lot of use out of it. Most of the time, I don't use a rifle case if I take it out, and I just throw it in the back of the truck or whatever. It's bouncing on stuff. Nothing broke. It's relatively good. The scope caps, I usually get the rubber bands on there and kind of hold it down and cinch it down. That's what I got going on here, so they don't get inadvertently knocked open, because I always break them off. I like my scope caps to last for more than a day, so I just cinch them down with rubber bands. The overall fit and finish is phenomenal. It's very, very clean. Steiner does a good job in their presentation. The color is interesting. It's not really a flat dark earth. It's more of a coyote tan type color. It doesn't really have the same exact profile as some of the coyote tans I've seen, which is, I think, what they're calling it in the book. I can't remember what color they call it. Of course, there is a range of that color that you're going to see in plastic parts or finishes or paints. This has kind of a brownish green, interesting kind of tinge to it. It kind of has a European greenish, kind of real light green kind of pea color to it. I actually think it works fine. Functionally, is totally fine. I'm not about matching colors. That actually violates the laws of camouflage sometimes. So just having it not be black, I can get it ready for the dance, so you don't have to go over the entire scope and tape everything off and paint it, which is the main thing I'm trying to accomplish. So I think the color works fine. The ruggedness of the turrets, the tactile indicator that pops up is very small. It's a little cylinder that comes up above the elevation turret. When you pass into that second turn on your elevation ring, it just pops up a little bit so you can feel it in the dark, or you can just take a glance over the top of the scope and you can see it poking out there. Those deals make me a little nervous. I didn't try to break this, but if you do drop that rifle right on there, on some of the PM2 designs, I know the mechanism for that little pop-up deal can get jammed in there, and it'll actually impede the function of the scope and break that feature. When it comes to the tactile indicator, that's something that I like to operate into my standard operating procedure. You dial it below that second elevation turn so that it goes back in and retracts before you start trying to move around and stuff like that, so you don't break that thing. That is one potential weak point of this design, unless they got something else going on proprietary wise that I am unaware of. The ocular ring seems like it's built pretty tough. The magnification, the parallax, all that stuff looks pretty good. The illumination adjustment ring, I'm not sure how that's going to fare over a 300-year period, but it worked totally fine for the last couple years. I don't like crank on it all day. That's probably the least rugged feeling of all the different parts on the optic. Overall, the Steiner optics are very rugged. Comparatively speaking, there's not really a lot of stuff that's going to beat them. When you're talking about military-grade precision rifle optics like this in this class, the Steiner actually seems a bit more robust, in my opinion, than some of its other competitors. I really like my Schmidt & Benders. I really like Collis. They're great. But Steiner seems to be pretty darn rugged, and some of the construction of it, I think, would be conducive to exceptional ruggedness for most operational environments. I think that the function and place of this optic in the general precision shooting world is going to be placed with your medium to long-range shooters. I think that most of the reticle and how this thing is set up and configured is going to be very handy for that. That's why this thing ended up on my Steyr SSG08. From 300 to 1,000 meters, this thing is just going to own it. This optic is going to do perfect. I can do a lot of my stadiometric ranging inside that distance. Once you get too far out, that stadiometric ranging capability is not as effective as your ballistics start to get kind of radical. But inside 1,200 meters, you can really do a good job without using lasers or any special tools other than the reticle. You can do almost everything you need to do in the reticle, so I think it's well fit on something like a standard short action cartridge like the 308. You could even use it on, magnums. It would work great. This would work fantastic for 338s and your large calibers as well, because it does have that ULR and ELR capability in the MSR2 reticle. So it's very flexible. You have a lot of different options you can use it for in the long range shooting world. Is it something I'd throw on a carbine? Probably not. But for any kind of long distance dedicated platform, I think this is a great configuration. It offers all the different things you would need to have for that to work well. For the price point and value, a lot of people ask, and we had this conversation with multiple people that I hung out with out in the field. Hey man, do you think this is really worth $4,000 plus, like, because you can buy stuff that performs 95% as good for way cheaper in, $500 price range. If you spend your money right, or $1,000, you can get stuff that gets most of it done. Why would you spend so much more money on something like this? Now, I don't think most people probably need to. In all honesty, doing a fully honest review, most shooters, you don't need to spend this kind of money. There's a lot of other stuff that'll work just fine. But for the target market here, this is a professional grade scope developed for militaries and for police snipers. Now, in those circumstances, you have people's lives on the line, and there are certain things that have to be kind of checked off the boxes. I think where a lot of the money goes when you're talking about the price point here is actually in the inspection, the quality control procedures that they have at Steiner. Optics that get these big military contracts, they're typically got a very high inspection rate. I know some of them had, for a while, 100% inspection. Every single scope went through all the inspections to verify that it would be good, because you don't want to give this to a shooter. You don't want to issue it without knowing it's going to work. That quality control and holding those standards of quality adds up to a lot of extra money to accomplish that. In terms of just throwing a scope together and not looking at what you did, that's why so many scopes are a lot more affordable. Most of them, probably over 90% are going to turn out fine, but having those quality control measures in place to verify, like a seal didn't get folded incorrectly and it's going to fail the atmosphere test. So then now it's not waterproof, and now you're rendered like ineffective if you're like coming off the beach with your rifle in some kind of MAROPS type deal or something. You need to have all those boxes checked for professional operators. There's just way too much on the line when you're talking about some of these more robust operations. You got 100 guys depending on you to have your stuff ready to go, and if it's not, it throws a monkey wrench into the whole deal. And so investing a little bit in equipment like this, it's not really that much money for militaries or governments. If you look at how much they spend just on silly stuff all the time, spending a bit more on an optic is definitely something they can afford to do. So for a professional shooter, absolutely, I think the Steiner is going to be awesome. There's a lot of governments and militaries that totally agree with that, as said, because they're using it in the field right now, and really, really good. I think that if you would place this into the tiers of different tactical rifle scopes, this would definitely be in tier 1 for sure. Where would it fit into tier 1? Next to the old standard Schmidt-Bender PM2s and your Collis and some of your Swarovski, your Zeiss Hensoldt, some of the 40 millimeter main tube stuff out of Romania. Where does it fit in with there? I think that it's going to be towards the upper end. There are certain things that some of those other models of other scopes might outperform this one on, but this one overall is really, really good for what it's designed to do in terms of ruggedness and reliability. I think that it's right towards the top of tier 1, in my opinion. So there's my review of the Steiner M7Xi. I hope this was helpful for you guys. I do spend a lot of energy and a huge amount of resources putting these reviews together when I do a comprehensive review. A lot of time switching it around, testing it. You guys know how expensive ammunition is. It's definitely not a cheap endeavor. If you go ahead and subscribe, that's awesome. Support us in sharing the videos, whatever, stuff like that. That's great. And, provide spiritual support by giving me a little click of the thumbs up deal, and then I'll be purring more happily over here where I'm at. Do check out opticsplanet.com. They have an incredible amount of stuff for sale there. They always got pretty good deals. Everything from space telescopes to binoculars, rifle scopes, accessories, all different kinds of stuff. Check it out. Leave your thoughtful commentaries below. I usually go straight for the commentaries a couple days after the video and enjoy reading those. So thanks for watching. Subscribe to Rex Reviews and all that stuff, and I'll catch you guys on the flip side.